Hello everyone, good afternoon. I'm Ankit and you're watching StudyIQ IS. Now, yesterday an important event happened in India's economy, that was the release of economic survey for the year 2024-25. So we'll be taking up today the highlights and important details. Excuse me. साउंड उसका टीवी का, हाँ साउंड कोई बात नहीं, जाओ कर दो. Thank you. Sorry for the disturbance. There was this sound coming in. So as I was saying, let me lock the door. So as I was saying, we are going to discuss today the economic survey, important highlights that the economic survey gave us yesterday. Now as usual, before the end of the session, I will be uploading my notes on the Telegram channel called ATS Live. So you have an option either to search the keywords ATS Live on the Telegram's search bar, which is located on the right hand top corner of the mobile app. Or also if you're still unable to find the channel, you always have an option to scan the QR code which I have given you. Now the provision or the reason why am I taking this highlights is that economic survey document which was released yesterday, this one, it is a 482 page long document. And if you're going to read even 40 pages every day, which is a task, believe me, even if you're reading 40 pages every day, you'll take up at least 12 days to complete reading the economic survey and include 2 days additional for notes making. It will take 2 weeks of your precious time just to complete this bulky document. Now, economic survey, if you don't know it already, it is a summation of every policy measure that the government has taken place in various different sectors over the past year. So that is why this year the economic survey highlights 2024 and 25, because it is a summation of the ongoing financial year. However, the union budget which has been presented few hours before, it is a union budget for next financial year. That is why the union budget, you will find it is written 2025 and 26. Whereas the economic survey, it is of the current financial year, that is 24-25. So this is the distinction that the Union Finance Ministry takes in its documents. That is, the economic survey is of the past 1 year, that is the ongoing year, whereas the budget is for the next financial year, 2024-25. Now this document is prepared by Department of Economic Affairs under the leadership of the Chief Economic Advisor, who currently is Mr. Anant Nageshwaran. Now, in his policy document, Mr. Anant Nageshwaram gave many figures which we can utilize in our mains answer writing. Also, important trends that are given in this economic survey, they can be subjected to a prelims question in this year's prelims exam. So that is why reading and understanding this key document is a very key of you clearing prelims as well as mains examination, which is ultimately the goal of every aspirant. Understood? Good afternoon, Saujanya. Good to see you here. Now let us start our today's discussion. I will take up each and every chapter of the economic survey and I will tell you the important details and highlights of what this chapter entails in the current ongoing Indian economy and how can it be quoted in your mains answer writing. We'll also understand many of the facts and figures related to important macroeconomic indicators which have been provided in the economic survey. Now we start our today's discussion with the first chapter of the economic survey that gives a state of economy, that it provides an overview of what the growth rate of the world is and how it compares to that of India's economic growth rate. Now in this chapter, the economic survey starts off with projecting the global economy, and it states that global economy, it average grew by about 3.3% in the year 2023 as against the projection of IMF previously. It said that it will grow about 3.2%. Now there are many reasons across the world because of this why the economic growth has been subdued. First is that there are many geopolitical tensions that are going around right now. Most of these geopolitical tensions you can see are arising in the area of Middle East, where previously until few days back both Hamas as well as Israel were in a state of war, and this created an economic disruption in a key area which is a key supplier of crude oil across the world. Also, there is another geopolitical tension which has been going on for years now. It is the war between Ukraine and Russia. And because of Russia-Ukraine war, the Western nations, they have betted towards Ukraine, and as a result, they have imposed many kind of economic sanctions on Russia to crush its economy and to prevent it from exporting key of its inputs such as crude oil and natural gas. And because of these kind of geopolitical tensions and the resultant effect on economy, the world's growth rate has been subdued, and that is why it has grown just by 3.3%. Also, with onset of President Trump as the new president of the United States, we have witnessed he has threatened many countries that if they do not agree with his policy measures, President Trump is expected to levy tariffs on these countries, which includes major economies like China and India. Now, these kind of threat of imposition of tariff that goes against the very basic nature of world trade, because you want the world trade to be as low tariff as possible and as free as possible. Whereas on the other hand, imposition of tariff, it can create a lot of problem for many people. Understood? So that is why such kind of a geopolitical tensions and global trade risks, they inhabit the world economy, and that is why the global growth rate has been subdued. Now let us compare what global growth rate is in terms of globally, in terms of developed as well as emerging economy. Now I told you in the past few years, the world has grown at an average rate of 3.3 to 3.4%, whereas on the other hand, the advanced economies like US, UK, etc., they have grown at a much lower rate of about 2%. On the other hand, the emerging economies like Brazil, India, even China for that matter, they have grown at a much higher rate as compared to advanced economy to about 4.4 to 4.2%. So this was the emerging economies growth as compared to world and advanced economies growth. Now let us understand what is India's growth prospect in this matter. But before that, you have to understand that the global trade risks across the world has increased in the past year, and because of this, there is a higher world trade uncertainty index which is highlighted here. You can see earlier it was just 8.5, now it has increased to 13. On the other hand, higher geopolitical risks like the war which has been going on in the Middle East as well as between Russia and Ukraine, it has also increased geopolitical risks from 121.7 to about 133.6. So this highlights that the world economy is undergoing currently many kind of trade related as well as geopolitical tensions, and which has inhibited the growth prospects of world economy. Now let us compare the growth prospects of world economy with that of India. Now on the other hand, India's growth rate across many years, even after the pandemic, is much higher than you compare it with the advanced economy as well as other emerging economy. For example, India has grown about 6.4% in the last financial year, which is very close to the decadal average growth rate that India has witnessed, about 6.6%. So even with several tensions that exist in the world economy, primarily geopolitical tensions as well as trade policy risks, even then Indian economy is growing much higher, that is about 2% higher than the emerging economy's growth rate. And there are many reasons to it. First of all, ours is a growing economy which has a large presence of people who are willing to work in India. Also, the demand of goods and services in India remains much above what is the demand in the world, and that is why our growth rate is much higher. Now, economic survey, it states that India's real GDP growth rate is estimated at about 6.4% in the current financial year, and it estimates that in the next financial year it will increase slightly about to 6.8%. So these kind of figures you can quote in any of the answers that demand or that asks you to state the GDP growth rate of the country. And these kind of figures, especially the figures that have been published by the official documents, are the way to go when you start your answer writing. Understood? Now, because of this growth rate, India wants to make it much higher. For that, what is needed is grassroots level structural reforms, what is the structural reforms entail, we'll understand this in the course of our today's discussion, and also deregulation of the key sectors are key to achieve higher growth rate in India. So this is what the economic survey starts with, that it compares world's growth rate and it highlights that India's growth rate is much higher, but there is a potential to bring India's growth rate at a much higher rate, that even above 6.8%, and for that we need grassroots level structural reforms as well as deregulation of important sectors so as to unlock the potential of economy. Understood? Now let us understand what are the various sectors or the various sectors that combine or they contribute to the Indian economy. Now in our previous discussion, I must have told you that the expenditure level of estimation of national income, it highlights four kind of various heads. First is private final consumption expenditures, that is PFCE. It is the highest contributor to India's growth rate, that is about 60%. The second highest contributor is gross fixed capital formation, that contributes to about 30% to India's growth rate, whereas the third highest contributor is government's final consumption expenditure, that contributes about 10% to India's growth prospects. Whereas the last term, that is India's net exports, which is the difference between exports and imports, it contributes negatively to Indian economy. And because of that, you can see even today the contribution, especially from the private final consumption expenditure, it is more than 60%. And what this tells you, that Indian people privately, in their private consumption basis, they are trying to spend more and more amount of money. And this is where this data contradicts the data which is published in the newspapers these days, because from our previous discussion we have heard that India's economy is subdued only because the private final consumption expenditure, it is not as high as it should have been, and because of that, this subdued amount of private final consumption expenditure, it has also led to subdued amount of private investment such as gross fixed capital formation. So on the other hand, the economic survey highlights that this is much higher than 60%, that it is close to 62%, and this highlights the potential of Indian economy, especially from the point of view that people are willing to make more and more consumption expenditure, and for that there is a high demand for goods and services which should be manufactured and supplied to people. And this is how the survey highlights that India has a potential to increase its economic growth much higher than what is projected, that is 6.8%. Understood? And in our discussion also, we'll look at various other indicators that states actually that the consumption expenditure of Indian economy is increasing day by day, and we'll try to understand that. Understood? Now, this chapter also summarizes various developments that will follow in the next few chapters of the economic survey. First of all, it states that retail headline inflation, which has been a source of tension for Indian policymakers, it softened this year from about 5.4% to 4.9% in the period of April to December 2024. And if you recall, the RBI, it is statutorily mandated to keep the inflation level between 2% to 6% of the consumer price index, and consumer price index is what you can call the headline inflation. Understood? So from that perspective, you can say the inflation levels in Indian economy is comfortable, well below what the RBI is required to keep, that is at 4.9%, and this is a positive development in Indian economy. Also, capital expenditure, particularly the expenditure made by the government, is the driver of Indian economy after the pandemic struck India. And this particular expenditure made by the government creates new infrastructure, it leads to creation of new jobs, and hence it drives the economy much higher than what is expected. Now this capex, it has improved continuously. However, for the past few months, it was seen that the capex specially made by the government was some kind of subdued. And why was it subdued? Because India witnessed elections in the past 1 year or so in many states, including the election to the India's Lok Sabha. And that means the model code of conduct, it was in application for most of the time last year. And as model code of conduct was in application, it restricted the government to make newer spendings into the newer project. And as a result, the capex in the months of election was subdued. However, now the elections to most of the states have been completed, and it will be completed in Delhi by February 5th. So you can expect the capex to grow much further by what it is going. and this will be the sole factor of what it will drive India's economy to a much higher level. Now, good morning, Khokar, Fulkit Khokar, if I'm pronouncing your name right. Sorry, good afternoon. Yes, as I was saying, India's account now it consists of 7th largest share in exports. Now, India is a major exporter of services, particularly the services related to IT sector as well as telecommunication. And this IT sector and its exports is a driver of India's net exports to the world. And because of these exports, we have seen that it has reduced the pressure on our current account deficit, because India is a net importer of merchandise, that is goods. However, as it exports services much more than it imports, hence it balances out our balance of payment. And because of this service exports, India is now a major shareholder in the global service exports. Further, during the April-December 2024, non-petroleum and non-gems and jewelry sector, the exports went up by 9.1%. It highlights that the resilience of merchandise exports in India despite subdued global atmosphere. And because of this subdued global atmosphere, it was originally expected that our exports will fall down. But because of contribution of non-jewelry and non-petroleum export sector, which is not a traditional stronghold of India, India's exports still carried on much higher than what was expected. So this was the positive development that India saw. First of all, the inflation was controlled. India's capital expenditure, particularly the expenditure made by government in this regard, it went up high. Whereas India's exports, particularly service exports as well as non-petroleum and non-jewelry exports, it grew further. And this put India into a much comfortable position as far as world economy is concerned. Understood? Now, the activity of manufacturing or services in any country is measured by an economic indicator called as Purchasing Managers Index. Whenever this Purchasing Managers Index is more than 50, you can understand there is a growth in manufacturing as well as services. Understood? So you can see from this graph, which highlights this line here is the level of 50, and India's PMI manufacturing as well as PMI services, which is highlighted by these three lines as well as a composite PMI, it has remained above the levels of 50 since June 2021, and now it has increased at a much further distance from 50. And this highlights India's expansion in economic activities much more significant and steady than it was before. So all of these data, as I've told you, it perpetuates or it highlights that India's economy is growing further, and you can utilize this data to highlight that India's economy is in much comfortable position as compared to other areas. Understood? Now let us understand, or let us move to the next chapter, which deals with the monetary and fiscal or very financial sector development. Now this chapter actually starts with the fact that India's financial sector, particularly represented by scheduled commercial banks, they are having much better financial health as compared to the past decade. And the most important factor that highlights good health of India's banks is the reduction in non-performing assets. Now you understood what is non-performing assets. These are loans which had been given by banks, and the interest or the principal amount, if they are not paid for more than 90 days, these kinds of loans, they are categorized as a non-performing asset. So you understand, the non-performing assets or the loans that is extended by the banks, if they do not return back to banks, it is a problematic to its own financial balance sheet. So whenever banks is witnessing reduction in the NPAs, it states that the bank's business is witnessing much higher return. And as a result of gross reduction in NPA, Indian banks have witnessed much better financial health. As you can see, the NPA, which was about 7.3% in March 2021, in the span of 5 years or the 4 years in total, it has reduced to an all-time low of 2.6%. On the other hand, the profitability of banks, it has increased, which is highlighted by a figure called return of assets, which was just 0.7%, and it has doubled actually to 1.4% in the months of September 2024. Now, both of these indicators, that is reduction in the gross NPA and increase in return of assets, highlights that the bank's financial health has improved manifold. Also, The bank sector, it has exhibited improvement, as I've already told you, and the profitability of scheduled commercial banks, it has increased because of fall in gross NPAs as well as rise, and because of this fall in gross NPAs, the banks have been able to strengthen their balance sheet by increasing the amount of provisioning into the capital risk to weighted asset, also known as CRAR. Now the banks are known to keep some amount of money aside which can be utilized in the dire financial situation. So more amount that the banks keep aside as a part of its CRAR, the better is the bank's financial health. So you can see, as the profitability of commercial banks have increased and its non-performing assets have reduced, this has resulted into improvement in the capital to risk weighted ratio, or what the banks keep aside for its capital requirements. Also, the bank's credit, it has grown at a steady rate. That is, the bank's credit growth, it has outpassed the nominal GDP, which you can see from this figure. Because from the figure, you can easily deduct that India's nominal GDP has remained at the levels of about 12 to 13% annually. This is nominal GDP. Whereas on the other hand, the bank's credit, it has grown steadily much higher than what India's nominal GDP is about. So that is why whenever banks extend loans, these loans are used for productive economic purposes by the borrowers, like setting up of new factories or increasing investment in their agriculture, or even for the consumption matters, that they are buying more cars, vehicles, etc. All of this creates demand in the economy. And to fulfill these demands, the factories, they increase their production, which leads to increase in salaries of the existing employees and hiring of new employees. So the uptick in banks' credit, it highlights that India's economy is growing further, that people are taking more and more amount of loans and they are using these loans for economic productive purposes. Understood? So this is how banks' financial health is related to India's macroeconomic prospects. That better is banks' financial health, the more you can expect the India's economy to grow further. Understood? Now, one of the major factors of improving the bank's financial health is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Now, what is this code actually? It tries to recover the money that the companies who have unpaid or not able to pay the loans back to the banks, these kind of adjust or they register for the process of Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. And through this process, the amount which has been logged as a part of non-NPAs or the non-performing assets, these are unlocked by the process of liquidation or by the process of recovery of these assets. Now, the economic survey highlights that the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, it has witnessed resolution of more than 3.6 lakh crore rupees, which is about 161% more than what banks had expected through the process of liquidation. Now, there are two types of processes involved in the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. For example, if a company files for Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the management of this company passes on from its promoters to a professional who is appointed by the IBC, and this is the professional's responsibility to get these companies start working back again. However, if the potential of starting the company is not fulfilled, then the liquidation or selling of the assets takes place. So these are two kinds of expectations that you can have from the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and it is more desirable to undertake the resolution of company rather than liquefying its assets. So the economic survey highlights that resolution of as much as 3.61 lakh crore rupees has happened, and this has enabled the companies to return their loans back to the banks, and as a result, the bank's financial health, it has improved. Understood? Also, this highlights that India's capital markets like equity markets, etc., these are witnessing increased return from the people in general, because we have seen trends in the past few years, especially after COVID-19 pandemic, that people started investing their money not in banks fixed deposits or in saving banks deposit, but rather they are trying to invest their hard-earned money into India's financial markets like capital markets. Now, because of these capital markets and improved people's outlook towards these markets, the net investments of people money have increased in India's capital market, which is highlighted that almost 11.1 lakh crore of funds, these have been mobilized from primary markets like issuance of IPOs, as the survey highlights that number of IPOs, they have increased to 259 in the past few months as compared to 196 in the similar period of last year. So this highlights that more and more companies are taking funds from the financial market through the issuance of initial public offering. And this also highlights that people are buying to invest, or they are trying to invest more in the new companies, which highlights that India's capital market performance has actually improved in the past few months. Also, the market capitalization to the GDP ratio, it stood at 136%, and when you compare it with number of demat accounts that you are required to open a demat accounts once you participate in the capital market, this has also rose by 33% to 18.5 crore. Also, one of the key measures if you want to invest your wealth in the country's capital market is if you want to do SIPs or systematic investment plans into the instruments called as mutual funds. Now, there are number of unique mutual funds in India, and because of these, investors have actually doubled in this mutual fund, and monthly SIP, it has also doubled in the past few years. So this highlights that people of India, including people like you and I, we are investing our money into our capital markets, and this investment trend has actually improved our health of India's capital markets. As you can see from various figures that companies are issuing more IPOs, there are doubling of amount of numbers of investors in the mutual fund, and including they are doubling their investment in form of IPAs, and also the number of demat account has rose by 33% into the year-on-year basis. So this highlights the improvement of India's capital markets. Now, Indian stock market in general, they have outperformed many emerging market peers like Brazil, South Africa, etc. And India's insurance market also, it continues to grow as the premiums in Indian economy, it rose by 7.7%. On the other hand, the number of pension subscribers in India, they are growing by 16%. So this highlights the overall health of India's financial sector, as these companies, these are important financial behemoths in Indian economy. Understood? Now, one of the key measures of government of India is that it has tried to bring what is known as financial inclusion, and one of the key measures or the policies by current government was that it brought Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, where bank accounts of unbanked people, they were opened, and this unlocked the potential of formal economy in India. As you can see, India's financial inclusion has increased as per the RBI's financial inclusion index, which rose from 53.9 to 64.2, and also this highlights the improved performances of regional rural banks. These are banks which are primarily located in rural areas, and they have their branches in rural areas, and most of their customers are also people who are living in rural areas. Now, in terms of its share in rural branches, these RRBs, they constitute about 30% of all rural branches by Indian banks, whereas in terms of deposit, they corner about 13.7% of all deposits in India, and they have about 8% share in the loans extended in the public. So this is the importance of regional rural bank, that it has about 1/3 share in all rural branches and 14% share of all bank branches in India, and as compared to deposits, it corners about 14% of total deposits made in Indian bank accounts. So this is how existence of regional rural banks, it has increased the banking potential, especially provision of banking services to rural people, as they have now bank accounts which was made under Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, and this highlights the success of government's intention to bring financial inclusion in India. Understood? Now, moving to the third sector, that is the external sector. Now, external sector deals with everything that goes out of India in form of exports and that comes into India from other countries in form of imports. So these all constitutes the external sector. Now, the economic survey, it starts with the fact that there is a rise in global trade uncertainty. And why is that? Because I told you, President Trump is in power in the United States and he has threatened to levy tariffs on various countries including China and India. And because of this threat of imposition of tariffs, it is expected that across the world, the levels of trade policy and its uncertainty is expected to increase. And this is a bad news for global trade. However, there is a rebound in global trade in 2024 because of uptick in employment potential as well as growth sector in the emerging economy. So these are the two contradictory terms. First of all is that it states there is a rise in global uncertainty at the time when world is witnessing rebound in global trade. So how this pans out in the future, we'll know in the news developments in the following year. Now let us understand what are India's trade prospects, particularly with respect to external sector. Now if you see from the graph here, India's merchandise export, which was about $317 billion in the last financial year, it has increased marginally to about 322. Now there are many reasons why this India's exports have only increased marginally, and this is primarily due to reduction in the petroleum prices, as India is a major exporter of petroleum products, and as the prices of these petroleum products have reduced, even despite the fact that India is exporting more petroleum products, the increase in merchandise exports was only a meager amount. Whereas as compared to other factor, you can see that there is an increase in merchandise exports from $506 billion to $533 billion. But this also highlights an important thing, that the demand for goods from imports, it is increasing in India, which highlights that people are witnessing more to spend money or they want to consume more. So this adds to the fact that I told you, India's consumption expenditure, particularly the private final consumption expenditure, it is increasing. So one of these factors also highlights that if there is an increase in imports in our country, that is why you can highlight that the private final consumption expenditure, it is also increasing. Also, we can see that there is an increase in merchandise trade deficit. Whereas on the other hand, as I've already told you before, exports of non-petroleum exports have increased, and so does export of non-petroleum and non-jewelry exports. So these are the good points, that India's exports, particularly in the non-traditional domain, which is not a strong point of India, it has increased, and so does India's imports, which highlights that there is an increased demand for goods in India. Understood? Now this highlights the same thing that I told you. The decline in value of petroleum exports is the primary reason why India's exports have only increased by a some amount, whereas increase in surge of imports highlight that there is a rebound in domestic consumption, which is a good news for India. Because if there is a rebound in domestic consumption, you can also highlight that India's industry will also try to meet the needs for this increased amount of demand for goods. Now, overall exports of India, combining both merchandise and service exports, it grew by 6%, and the major factor in this 6% growth was the growth in service exports in India. Because you have seen India commands a dominant position, that it is world's 7th largest exporter of services, and when it compares to exporting of telecommunication, computer and import services, here India is the world's 2nd largest exporter. Now, this is the factor why primarily by export of services, particularly IT services, India's exports have grown at a much higher rate than India's merchandise or goods exports. On the other hand, this has milded, or this has reduced India's current account deficit to just 1.2%, and this is because of net rise in service receipts as well as net private transfer receipts, which are examples of remittances transfer made by Indian people living abroad. So these two factors, that is rise in export of services and rise in supply of private remittances, are the factor why India's current account deficit has actually reduced to just 1.2% despite increase in India's import of goods. Understood? Also, we have witnessed that the FDI inflows, which are important for development in India, it witnessed a downfall after the financial year 2021. However, the good news is that from the past financial year, this has increased to about 17% in general. Now, this explains that Indian market is witnessing more investment from abroad, and this creates the potential of further economic growth. Further, most of the investment that was cornered was made by the service sector, particularly related to finance and insurance sector, as it cornered the highest share in the import of services, and this was followed by computer software and hardware and other trading services. So this is the sectoral composition of the FDI, that the highest FDI was cornered by financial services, followed by IT sector, etc. Whereas despite falling in the past few years, India's FDI, it has increased an uptick in the last financial year. So this text highlights the same thing. Gross FDI inflow, it recorded a revival in the last financial year and it witnessed a year-on-year growth of 17.9%. Whereas on the other hand, India's forex reserve, it stood at about $640 billion. For example, if you can see here, India's forex reserve, it reached to a level of $706 billion. However, as India's rupee is witnessing depreciation, and that prompted the RBI to use its foreign reserve to improve the supply of dollars in Indian economy. This has created a downfall in India's forex reserve. But still, despite falling from 706 to 640 billion dollars, India's foreign exchange reserve can cover imports for about 10.9 months. So this is India's import cover of the forex reserve is all about, which means that India is in a very comfortable position from the external sector point of view. And this reduction in the import cover is due to the fact that RBI is using the foreign exchange reserves to supply or increase the supply of dollars in the economy. And when you compare it with India's net external debt to GDP ratio, it stood at just 19.4%, which means India's external sector also, when it comes to repayment of debt, it is in a much comfortable position because the share of external debt to GDP is just below 20%. Now moving to the next chapter, which highlights prices and inflation. This chapter actually deals with the fact of how prices and inflation has changed the growth prospects in India. Now let us understand this. Now this graph behind me, it gives three figures, that is CPI inflation, core inflation. Now CPI inflation here is called as headline inflation, whereas if you deduct headline inflation from fuel and food, so if you minus food and fuel inflation from headline inflation, what you get is core inflation. Now if you see from here, India's headline inflation, which is represented by this green line, it has stayed very close to 6% here. Understood? However, when you deduct food and fuel inflation, India's core inflation is at a much comfortable level. And what does it mean? That there should be some factor, particularly food and fuel, which has contributed to increase in India's inflation prospects. Understood? So let us understand this from this discussion. If you minus headline inflation from the prices of top, that is tomato, onions and potato, as well as if you exclude vegetables and pulses, all of these had high inflation in the past 1 year, and you will see that the inflation drops to a much lower level. So this highlights that there was this increase in prices of vegetables as well as pulses, particularly tomatoes, onion and potatoes, which contributed to inflation in India in the past 1 year. And this also highlights the consumer food price index. If you exclude top and if you exclude vegetables and pulses from India's consumer price index, it is at a much comfortable level here. Understood? So the primary inference from these kind of data is that India witnessed a high inflation, particularly in vegetables and pulses, which are an essential commodity in Indian homes, because regardless of the fact, you will be eating your vegetables, you will be consuming dals, sambars, etc., and all of these requires preparation using vegetables and pulses. So because of these increase in prices of these, India's inflation prospects, it increased quite a lot. Now the primary reason of increase in inflation in vegetables and pulses can be attributed to just one factor, that is the weather disturbances. Because these weather disturbances, they have the potential to reduce the yield of crops and also promote damage of existing crops, which highlights that the supply of these crops, they remain or they are affected. And as the supply of these crops are affected, the demand remains constant, and hence it pushes up the prices of these items. And from these graphs, you have said that the higher the number of disturbances or extreme weather events, it has contributed to inflation in these kind of fruits and vegetables as well as pulses. And as the supply of these vegetables as well as pulses were affected due to weather events, this has pushed up the prices and it has resulted into inflation in these commodities. And these commodities are the primary reason why India's inflation level stayed very close to the 6%, which is the upper limit of the what RBI wants to keep the inflation at. Now the global inflation rate, it has also moderated to 5.7%, whereas India's retail inflation rate, it also saw a reduction from 5.4% to 4.9%, primarily due to cooling off of food products prices. And RBI and IMF, it projects that India's consumer price index, it will stay at a very close to 4% level in the next financial year, which means the inflation prospect will not trouble us as much as it did in this financial year. Also, what we need is a climate resilient crop varieties and enhanced farming practices so as to prevent these crops from being damaged by weather events and also enhance their resilience in cases of increased disturbances in weather in the future. Now, there were many policy measures that were taken by the government primarily to deal with the food inflation when it arose at a significant level. First was that government imposed stock limit on wheat. It imposed duty-free imports, or it permitted duty-free imports for increasing the supply of pulses. And by imposition of stock limits on wheat under Essential Commodities Act of 1955, as well as Prevention of Black Marketing Act of the year 1987. And all of these contributed to increase in supply of cereals in the market. Also pulses, they were increased in supply through imports. Whereas the sale of vegetables, it took place in subsidized sale through outlets like Safal and Mother Dairy, which you will see in cities like Delhi. And also government improved on its buffer stock of onion as central nodal agencies like NAFED, they kept increased stock of onion which can be liquidated in the times of increase in prices. Also, government undertook open market sale scheme where it procures or keeps a buffer stock of many commodities like rice and wheat, and whenever the prices of rice and wheat they increase in the open market, the government liquidates its stock to increase the supply of such commodities. And all of these measures, that is imposition of stock limits or open market sale or even having a buffer stock, all of these were intentioned to just do one thing, that is increase the supply of these commodities whenever there is an increase in prices in the market. And when you increase the supply, the prices automatically they come down. Understood? So these were the administrative measures that were taken by the government, and in order to prevent increase in inflation in the future time, what we need is to develop crop resilient or weather resilient varieties and to have a sufficient amount of buffer stock in the future. Understood? Now let us move to another article. This chapter, it dealt with medium term outlook for India's growth, and it highlights that deregulation is a key to drive growth in Indian economy. Now, to realize the view of Viksit Bharat, that if you want to make India a developed nation by 2047, the economic survey highlights that India needs a growth rate of about 8% of GDP for about decade or two. That is, for a period of 10 to 20 years, India should grow at about 8% annually if it were to be developed by 2047. And for that, the economic survey highlights that there are many challenges that India might face in the coming future. First challenge is the global economic fragmentation. Now, you must have heard about the term called globalization. What is globalization? That the goods and services, they flow from one country to other with minimum disruption and with minimum tariffs. So this is the notion of globalization. And why we want globalization? Primarily, if we want to increase world trade, and with increase in world trade, the economic growth in every country will increase. However, in recent times, we have heard or we have seen a change in this trend, that instead of globalization, the world economy, it is witnessing more and more economic fragmentation. As world, it was not just one market now, rather it has become many markets, as countries, they are trying to negotiate free trade agreements which provides a preferential access to a set of countries. And this is what is called a global economic fragmentation. And countries which are out of these kind of global trade pacts like India, they will witness a tougher measure to increase its global trade. So this is one biggest challenge that India's growth economic prospects face. Also, China's manufacturing prowess is still very much intact, so you cannot expect that China will lose out on a much share of its export markets. Also, India is witnessing efforts on its energy transition, and it is moving to a less carbon intensive manufacturing process, and for that it is dependent more on countries like China for importing of key net growths like solar cells. So all of these factors, which is according to economic survey, can actually create a challenge for India's growth prospects in the next decade or two. And for it to become developed, India needs a higher economic growth rate for about 8%, and it should continue for a period of about 10 to 20 years. Now, let us understand what the suggestion that has been given by economic survey in this regard. First is that there should be a systematic deregulation in the India's economy. What do you mean by deregulation? That the controls of the government on Indian economy and its related sector, it should reduce further, as it has reduced for a much larger extent after the 1991 economic crisis. However, still, if you want to grow your economy further, the presence of the government in economy should reduce by a larger amount, and this is what systematic deregulation is all about. And this should be the most important policy priority for any government coming in the future if it wants to increase the growth potential of India. And this is key to reinvigorate the domestic levels of growth, as I told you, and this is a pursuit legitimate of economic activity, and these economic activities should be pursued by India's business sector with much ease. Understood? Now, in next step, what the economic survey highlights that the state government should work on liberalizing the standards and controls which inhibit businesses, to provide legal safeguards for enforcement of various directions, and also reducing the tariffs and fees which leads to increase in cost for key imports which are imported from other countries. And also we need to apply risk-based regulation for sectors that have huge kind of economic environmental risk. There the regulation should be high, whereas the sectors that are not prohibitive as far as social or economy is concerned, there the regulation should be minimal. And this will help India's economy to grow further, as it will create conditions for the businesses to thrive and invest more. Understood? Also, this highlights that the world currently is witnessing global economic fragmentation, which is affecting the prospects of global trade. So instead of focusing more on global trade, India should look to promote domestic drivers for growth, and which means India should create more economic growth in India, which can create more jobs, and it will lead to further economic growth. Also, deregulation, it raises investment and efficiency in India, and it bestows more economic freedom to individuals and enterprises, which means it creates conditions for ease of doing business. And when you create conditions for ease of doing business, it will mean that the more businesses will set up newer units, and this will further lead to creation of employment and generation of demand for goods and services. Hence, enhancing the economic freedom for both individuals and businesses is actually the means and end on how you will become a developed country. Now, moving to the next slide. As I told you earlier, the government, it undertook many reforms in the process of making India a country of ease of doing businesses. These included reduced compliance burden, as government, it coalesced 44 labor laws into just 4 different labor codes, which reduced the compliance burden for meeting labor needs. Also, it streamlined systems and processes, which eliminated redundancies and clarified the process flow, which increased again the ease of doing business. It digitized the system processes, as the need for seeking approval, it was made completely digitized, and you just provided with one portal, which streamlined the process of seeking approval. Also, it provided incentives through various schemes like production linked incentives, where the incentives are provided in 14 sectors that have a major potential to create employment in India. Also, these kind of sectors have the potential to increase the contribution of manufacturing in India's growth prospect. So these kind of support that was provided by the government of India in its first phase of providing ease of doing business, and now we need the second phase of ease of doing business, and this includes liberalization of standards and control that actually inhibit businesses, providing safe legal enforcement so that the companies who are actually following the rule of law, they are benefited, whereas the company who are negating or who is neglecting these rule of laws, they can be subjected to enforcement of standards. Also, we need to reduce tariffs and fees so as to make available the key inputs at a much lesser cost, which will also increase our competitiveness of exports when we are exporting these products made from cheaper inputs into the external sector. Also, we need to undertake risk-based regulation, as I told you, that the sectors that have or that impose higher risk on economy and environment, they should be regulated strictly, whereas the sectors that do not have such an high impact on economy and environment, they can be liberalized as they can be provided with less amount of regulation. Understood? Now, let us move to the another chapter. This chapter highlights the need for investment and infrastructure, as these two sectors are very closely related, because if you want to promote investment in any country, you have to provide them with the sufficient infrastructure, and sufficient infrastructure brings in higher investment. So these two have a cause and effect relationship, as one depends on the other. Now let us understand what are the key focus of the union government is on the past few years. As in the last 5 years, the government has actually increased its public spending on infrastructural sectors by speeding up approvals and also by mobilizing more and more financial resources. For example, the capital expenditures made by the union government in key economic sectors has grown by about 40% in the past 5 years, and this highlights that the major investment in the infrastructure sector is primarily done by the government. And why is government spending more and more on infrastructure? Because it will create the necessary infrastructure for India, which will increase the attraction for businesses to invest more in the country, and also it has the prospects of increasing employment generation and driving the economic growth further. Now, for example, you need better infrastructure when it comes to delivery of goods and services, and also in the transportation sector, because the major inhibitive factor that the India's economic growth has faced, that is the logistics cost in the Indian economy. It is much higher than what it is required. That in the developed and developing nation, it is between 8 to 9% of GDP, whereas India's logistic cost amounts to about 14% of GDP, and this is a very negative sign when you make or when you want to make your exports much more competitive. So in order to bring the cost of logistics down, the government has undertaken laying off newer railway lines, as more than 2,000 kilometers of railway network they were commissioned in the past few months. Also, about 6,000 kilometers of national highways was constructed, and also under National Industrial Corridor Development Program, 383 plots covering 3,788 acres of land, they were given permission to set up new industrial units. So all of these highlights that the government is doing everything from laying down of railway lines to construction of national highways to setting up of national industrial corridors, which is expected to drive the economy further. Now let us understand this in terms of deployment of high-speed trains. As you can understand, the most famous train of Indian Railways, the Vande Bharat train, which was just 2 between the year 2018 to 22. Now the numbers of Vande Bharat train have increased to 68, and it is expected to grow further in the coming years. Also, considering the fact coaches, production of coaches, it has also increased manifold. This was just 32 in the year 2018 till 22, whereas up till October in the year 2025, this has increased to 900. So this has the potential to actually fulfill the demand of passenger services of the Indian Railway, because we understand there are huge demand for Indian Railway services when it compares or when it deals with the ticket of people. However, the railway is still unable to meet the demand, and as a result, we have seen people taking the route of road, and this has led to congestions in the road. And this congestion is not just detrimental to India's growth prospects, but you also understand it declines the India's economic productivity, because people, instead of working, they are spending more and more times on road, which is again doing away with the need for work. So by improving the efficiencies of railways, by improving the speed of railways, and by making the logistics sector more efficient, it has the potential to drive growth, and it also has the potential of increasing the economic productivity of India's workforce. Understood? Also, when it comes to dealing with other sectors, for example, civil aviation, here the number of routes under regional connectivity scheme, that is another name for UDAN, it has improved that the number of airports under Udan have increased from 84 to 88, and so has the routes have increased from 545 to 619. And when it comes to dealing with the shipping sector, here the turnaround time of ships have reduced from about 2 days, that is 48.1 hours, to just 30.4 hours. So an average time that a ship requires in Indian ports to turn around is just 30.4 hours. Whereas on the other hand, this was about 48.1 hours before, which means now the ships, they are turning around quickly, which means more exports can happen through Indian ports. Understood? So this is how you undertake the capacity improvement of your logistics sector, and this improves the overall efficiency of Indian economy, that you can transport goods faster, the people can move from place A to place B at a much quicker time, which leaves them more time for their leisure and economic activity, and hence promoting the growth aspects of India. Also, the major improvements in recent time have been the developments in the power sector. For example, in the past 5 years, the capacity addition has been much higher, from 9,943 megawatts. Now the capacity addition is close to 15,000 megawatts, whereas in terms of transformer capacity, it has also increased. Now the most noticeable change in India's power sector is reduced reliance on fossil fuels, which was earlier contributing 61.4% to India's power generation, whereas this has reduced to just about 53%, whereas contribution of non-fossil fuel based sector, particularly renewable energy sources, hydropower, solar power, wind power, they have increased from 38.6% to 47.1%. So this highlights India is growing more and more reliant on renewable energy sources, and it is reducing the energy sources which are more polluting in nature, such as thermal power or coal-based power. Understood? So this is a major change in India's power sector, which is highlighted by India's economic survey. Also, the government's is undertaking many effort in the field of making India a more digital nation. For example, it has improved rollout of 5G services, that it is now available in all states and union territories. Further, the provision of these fast internet is not just related to rural urban areas, but now the faster net, especially the 4G services and the availability of connected broadband services, these are now available in the rural areas through schemes such as Universal Service Obligation Fund as well as Digital Bharat Nidhi. As these funds, they have been utilized to lay down a network of the optical fiber cables, and this has enabled delivery of faster internet services even to our country's rural area, which you can witness from this graph. As the numbers of towers, they have increased, so does the optical fiber cable which has been laid down under the BharatNet project, and the availability of high-speed broadband internet, it has improved from last year to about 12 lakh connections this year. So this highlights the overall ability of India to deliver digital services, and even these deliver of digital services has been done to rural areas at a much faster pace now. So that is why India is making much more rapid strides in the development of its economy. Further, investment in infrastructure has reached even to the rural areas, that with provision of services like Deen Dayal Upadhyay Gram Jyoti Yojana as well as Saubhagya initiative. Through this, the government has undertaken delivery of power in every villages, and also not just villages but in every households. So which has actually improved the socio-economic prospects of rural areas. Further, with Jal Jeevan Mission, over 15 crore families have gained access to piped rural drinking water, and under phase 2 of Swachh Bharat Gramin Yojana, now many villages in India, they have witnessed increased status from ODF to ODF plus status. Now ODF status earlier meant that the villages open defecation free. On the other hand, the ODF status, it improves the villages from being not just open defecation free, but now the villages are themselves managing the solid and liquid waste themselves. So this is when the villages are declared ODF plus. So the main target now is to declare more and more villages with ODF plus. So we can see from here the pipe delivery through this Jal Jeevan Mission, it was 3.2 crore back in August 19, it has reached 15.3 crore now, whereas many states here, they have complete full coverage of the pipe drinking water schemes. These are states such as Arunachal Pradesh, Goa, Haryana, Himachal, Gujarat, Punjab, Telangana and Mizoram. Understood? Whereas the numbers of villages who have become ODF free here, it was earlier lesser, as most of the villages were in the Jammu and Kashmir, Telangana as well as Kerala. Now this has improved to many parts of the Hindi heartland here, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Telangana as well as Himachal, Ladakh, Jammu Kashmir, Assam, etc. All of these states now have become ODF plus states, complete ODF plus states. So that is why the rural areas have witness socio-economic transformation, that from delivery of pipe drinking water inside their homes to delivery of electric or electricity connections, and improvement in their healthcare potential through the development of toilets in their homes, we have witnessed the socio-economic transformation of the villages. So this highlights that the improvement of infrastructure is not just made in urban areas, but also this has gained manifold amount in the rural areas also. Now, in terms of urban areas, what are the two major concerns that people face in urban areas? First is that they lack proper housing, or the housing is unaffordable, or the second factor is the congestion. Now, these two problems are dealt in detail by the government. First of all, government has made provisions for construction of newer houses under the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, its urban component, as 1.818 crore houses has been sanctioned, and more than 0.89 crores, that is 89 lakh of houses, they have been constructed in urban areas, which increases the supply of houses or accommodation in India, urban areas. Whereas in terms of urban transport, or to decongest the urban areas, India is witnessing more and more application of metro rail systems, as more than 1,000 kilometers of railway lines has been laid down in urban areas, and that has resulted into delivery of metro services, which has proven quite efficient as well as affordable to people. Also, for Atal Mission for Rejuvenation Urban Transformation, it has improved water coverage, as well as Smart Cities Mission have improved infrastructure in the urban areas. So not just rural but also urban transformation is taking place. As I told you, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana has completed 89 lakh houses, whereas city transportation network is witnessing more and more uptick with construction of newer metro rail as well as rapid rail projects. Also, in terms of transparency in India's real estate sector, which we witnessed faced many problems in the past few years, they have been dealt with passage of Real Estate Regulation and Development Act, which provides for establishment of a state-based body called RERA, and this body is responsible for addressing of complaints against the real estate private players. And through this, we have witnessed greater regulation as well as transparency in India's real estate sector. Further, dealing with investment and infrastructure here, what we know for sure is that the government is increasing its spending in India's infrastructure sector. But not just government, but we also need private sector to increase their investments so as to fulfill the gap that exists in the supply of infrastructure to the demand of infrastructure. So for that, private sector participation is very necessary, and for that the government in recent past have brought National Infrastructure Pipeline as well as National Monetization Pipeline, which looks to harness the potential of creation of new infrastructure and unlocking of existing infrastructure of the government. Good afternoon, Sejal. Now moving to the next chapter, this deals with industry. Now infrastructure and industry is very closely related, because if you demand creation of more infrastructure, it will automatically lead to higher output by the India's industry. For example, if you can see here, as I told you, more and more infrastructure is created, and that is why India is witnessing rising cement production as well as rising consumption of steel, all of which is used in construction of infrastructure. So that is why infrastructure is closely related to investment, because if you develop infrastructure, it will lead to higher investment in India, whereas if you develop infrastructure, it will also lead to uptick in the industrial sector, because industrial sector actually supplies raw material for the infrastructure sector. Further, the industrial sector, it is expected to grow by 6.2%, and this is driven particularly by two sectors, that is robust growth in electricity as well as construction activity. Also, India wants to improve the technological levels of its infrastructure and industrial sector by making them technologically advanced through the industrial process 4.0, and for that establishment of Samarth Udyog centers have taken place. Now what this Samarth Udyog sector does is that they undertake training of micro, small and medium enterprises as their employees are trained in order to make them more technologically advanced and able to use the digital services. So for that Samarth Udyog centers have been set up. Now the main reason is that we want to make better the financial health of India's micro, small and medium enterprises sector, because these are very important for India's economy as they contribute to about 45% of India's net exports. They provide employment to 11 crore people and they are responsible for contributing to India's GDP by about 30%. So these are the important facts that you can remember about MSME sector, that it contributes 45% to exports, it employs 11 crore people and it contributes 30% to India's GDP. So this is why we need to make better our micro, small and medium enterprises, and for that government is undertaking many steps. For example, we read recently that a new credit guarantee scheme has been put up so that the financial sector, they extend more formal loans to the MSME, so that the MSMEs you can use these loans to undertake capacity increasement or undertake technological development. Further, the equity funding to MSMEs have been provided under Self-Reliant India Fund, which has a corpus of 50,000 crore rupees, whereas micro, small and medium enterprises, they are participating in the cluster development program as a cluster of MSMEs will be set up, and in these clusters provision of common infrastructure will take place, which will allow these MSMEs to unlock their growth potential. So that is why MSMEs are a very important commodity or the component of India's industry, and we need to do everything so as to improve their economic prospects, and the government is doing so by provision of formal financing, provision of equity funding, and also by provision of common infrastructure through cluster development program. Further, India's, as I told you, right, India's demand for private consumption is increasing, and this can be highlighted by many other examples. For example, Indian automobile sales, they grew, which also highlights people want to consume more. Domestic production of electronic goods have grown. Why? Because the demand for electronic goods like mobiles, laptops have increased. Also, 99% of smartphones now, they are made in India, which has highlighted that India's dependence on imports for mobile phones have reduced. The total annual turnover for pharmaceutical sector, it is also improving, which means India's growth prospects, particularly to export of pharmaceutical products to Western markets, they have also increased. So this highlights that in the last 5 years, India has actually become more dominant as far as consumption based goods is concerned, because these kind of goods are demanded in Indian economy, and that is why the production and delivery of these goods have taken place. Now, also key export sectors like textile exports or exports of electronics industry, they have taken place, and this is highlighting that these exports have actually increased India's growth prospects. Now let us move to the another sector called as service sector. As I told you that the lack of India's exports in merchandise sector, it is compensated for more than compensated by India's service sector, because India is a net exporter of services. So we need this sector to be at much financial health. Now in recent times, the share of services sector in India's economy, it has grown further. It was close to 50% in the financial year of 2013. Now it has increased to about 55.6%. So the contribution of service sector has increased by 5.6% in the past decade, and also India's share in global exports have increased to about twice, from 1.9% to 4.3%. Now if you remember correctly, there was this question last year in the prelims examination that it stated that India's contribution in global merchandise exports was 4%. This was incorrect. Actually, it is contribution of service sector that is more than 4%. Understood? So that is how questions can appear in prelims, that if they ask you a trend, you have to remember the trend correctly. Now the service sector, the contribution of India's service sector in GVA has increased, as I told you from the graph also, and the average growth rate of service sector, which was 8% before the pandemic has struck, it has now improved to 8.3%. And further, India corners a share of 3% in global service export, which makes it 7th largest service exporter in the world. So these are key facts which you can quote in a very mains question. Also, the service export growth, it has surged to 12.8%. This is because of uptick in demand in Western nations. As the growth prospects of Western nations have improved in recent times, so has their demand for Indian services, and that is why Indian government and Indian companies, they are selling more and more services to the Western companies. And most of this is related to information and computer based services, which are also a part of IT sector, and these have witnessed upgrowth. And so has India's railway. It has recorded 8% growth in passenger traffic, which also highlights that India is consuming more. And the tourism sector, which is very important for the economy of Himalayan states as well as northeastern states or the islands of Lakshadweep and Andaman and Nicobar, these states are primarily reliant on tourism for their growth prospects. However, since pandemic has struck, we saw that the numbers of tourists who are witnessing or who are coming to these locations, they have fallen down. Now, this was a big cause of concern for India's economy. However, the tourist sector, it is contributing to GDP. It has returned to the pre-pandemic levels, which we can now understand has grown back to what the normal state was. So this is a good news for India, that tourism sector, which was primarily affected by the pandemic, it has now reverted back to its original state. Also, there are newer challenges that India faces as far as delivery of services is concerned, because delivery or export of services require people or require you to send people abroad on H1B and other important visas. However, we have seen in the recent past, there are increasing trends that are discouraging the movement of these exports to other countries, particularly in developed nations like UK and US, and this has created a sort of challenges. Further, this also creates a sort of differential in regulatory provisions, which ultimately leads to increase in cost of providing services, and this is where the competitiveness is going to be suffered because of new improved regulation and barriers to movement of people. Whereas in terms of opportunities, we are witnessing increased demand for embedded services such as digital services, and Indian companies, they are situated in a very good spot to offer these kind of services, which provides them with the opportunity for further growth. Also, Indian companies are very forward in adoption of digital technologies, which makes them a very good business prospects otherwise, wherever world is witnessing more uptick in use of AI in services, and this will help encash their strength in global trade of services. So the way forward in this regard is to provide appropriate skilling to your workforce so that they are trained in terms of newer technologies like AI and machine learning, and also reform grassroots level of procedures which actually hinder the development of growth of service sector in tier 2 and tier 3 rounds. So this is how we want to make our service exports more competitive, that is by basing them in the lesser developed towns, and also appropriately skilling our workforce in the service sector, which will enable them to get or deliver more and more technological based services. Now there is a very improved development in India's service sector, that is the growth of global capability centers. Earlier, what was the trend? That the low levels of services which require less expertise and lesser cost, these kind of services were sublet to India. For example, the call centers. However, now the trend is actually undertaken or rather reversed, that is delivery of high skilled services, especially by establishment of global capability centers in India. We have seen that the delivery of Indian services from lower cost has now increased to high skilled and higher cost, and this highlights the India's ability to navigate the changes in technology and provide the services at the highest level of technology at the best cost possible. So this is a very good opportunity for India's service sector is concerned. Now let us move to another chapter which is related to agricultural sector. Here the most important development in the recent times has been that the India's agricultural sector, it contributes to 16% of India's GDP, whereas comparing to number of people it employs about 45% of India's workforce. Now, the major growth in India's agricultural sector is not driven by food grains, rather it is driven by horticultural, livestock and fishery sector, because the livestock sector, it grew by 8.7%, the fishery sector, it grew by percent, whereas the livestock sector, it grew by 8%. And the one major change that has been brought in the agricultural sector is the provision of income support through PM Kisan scheme. Also through PM Kisan Mandhan Yojana, the government is looking to provide social security to India's farmers in general. So this highlights that the change of finances in farmers, especially by providing them with input support, has actually enabled them to take credit from the formal sources, and because of this we have seen a decline in non-institutional credit of farmers, and this also leads to increase in share of institutional credit. Whereas compared to growth of credit flow to the small farmers are concerned, especially through sectors or initiatives like priority sector lending, or through establishment of income support scheme, or opening of account through Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, we have witnessed more and more farmers in coming to the net of formal financial sector, and because of this even the small and marginal farmers, they have increased the reliance on formal sectors to meet their credit limits. So this reduces the vulnerability and this exposes them to the formal financial sector, which has the potential of providing them with much higher credit support at much lower interest rates. Also, India is trying to lower the cost of inputs of farmers is concerned, so as to increase the prospects of getting more and more income. So for that we need to promote the measures such as sustainable farming. For example, to promote organic farming in India, the government has came up with a scheme called Paramparagat Krishi Yojana, which promotes reliance on organic farming. And as you know, the organic foods, they are much higher demanded in the urban areas and they are available at much higher cost, and that is why it has the potential of increasing the incomes for the farmers. Also, to reduce their reliances on fertilizers, or to prevent the misuse of fertilizers like urea, the government is distributing soil health card, which will provide the exact information of what kind of macronutrients, what kind of micronutrients, or what kind of fertilizers should be used by farmers if we want to improve its agricultural yield. So that is done through soil health card. Also, by provision of micro irrigation through per drop more crop, government is looking to reduce the cost associated with irrigation, whereas National Bamboo Mission, it is particularly oriented with northeastern states, where the northeastern farmers, they can grow bamboo and sell it in the market for much higher income. Also, Mission Organic Value Chain Development is undertaking place in the northeastern region, because Sikkim was India's first organic state. Also, the prevalence and growth of organic food can be done at a much higher rate in the northeastern states, where it will provide much more higher incomes to the farmers. So because of all these factors combined, you can see the share of or area under micro irrigation in India, it has increased manifold, that it was just close to 3,000 hectare in India back in 2010 to 15. Now it has increased to about 8,000 hectare. So this is the changes of how the government is making in the policy of agriculture, that it is trying to reduce the cost of inputs for the farmers, which will ultimately lead to higher incomes. Understood? Now let us move to the another chapter. This is related to climate, environment and adaptation matters. First, you have to understand India wants to achieve the status of developed nation by 27. However, it wants to do so while becoming inclusive and making this growth prospects a sustainable development for everyone. So for that, the primary cause of concern for India is how it should reduce its emissions of greenhouse gases. Now for that, the government has came up with many solutions. First of all is the Lifestyle for Environment initiative, which aims to enhance country's sustainability efforts. Now, through this measure, the government wants to estimate that it can save consumers around $440 billion globally if the world tries to follow this India's Lifestyle for Environment initiative, which looks to reduce consumption and looks to lower the prices for everything. Now, how it is implemented on ground? First of all, it is done through a power of collective action, where a lifestyle change even by 13% of global population, it can reduce carbon emission by as much as 20%. On the other hand, if people they finish the food that is there on the plate, so for that 90 kgs of annual food waste can be prevented for just one person. Also, if we want to travel through carpool, it has the potential to reduce about 380 million liters of fuel just in India, and also recycling of tons of newspaper can avoid the wastage of 25,000 liters of water. So this is how sustainable consumption or sustainable development can lead to reduction in the use of resources, which ultimately result into lesser amount of emission of greenhouse gases. Understood? So this is what the government is trying to profess to not just to Indians but to also other countries. Also, government has trying to improve its progress towards the nationally determined contribution that it had made to the Paris Agreement, that it stated that it will generate about 50% of its electricity from non-fossil fuel based sources, and now 46.8% of India's electricity, as I've told you before, it is generated from non-fossil fuel based sources. So India is on well track to achieve its target of 50% of non-fossil fuel based energy generation by the year 2030. Whereas in terms of forest cover is concerned, India has actually bettered its forest cover and it has created an additional carbon sink of about 2.29 billion tons. And this highlights the progress that actually India has made in terms of meeting the NDC targets or the net determined contributions. Also, India has undertaken many climate initiatives that it has trying to reduce the emissions of energy intensive sector like steel, aluminum, etc. by trying to shift them away from carbon intensive to a more renewable based energy sources like green hydrogen. So this highlights that India is a responsible country when it tries to meet its global requirement of reducing the greenhouse gases emissions. Further, India also wants to improve the prospects of adaptation. That is, it wants to change its economy by making it more receivable or more amenable to the changes of climate. For that, it needs adaptation. But the world itself or the developed countries itself, it wants to mitigate the changes. That is, it wants to completely shift away India from its developmental path. So that is why you will see that the most finances that are contributed by developed countries or multilateral and bilateral initiatives, these are done for mitigation, whereas India is favoring more for these kind of finances that deals with adaptation. So this is how the global financing of climate change, it is not so tilted in India's favor or it goes against India's favor. Now in this regard, let us understand the challenges that India faces in meeting its net targets for reducing the greenhouse gases. For example, as I told you, India, in order to become developed, should grow at an annual growth rate of 8% of GDP for the next 10 to 20 years. However, how is this possible if India wants to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases? Because you understand there is a direct correlation. If you want to undertake higher economic growth, there is a negative consequence to it that it will ultimately lead to higher emission of greenhouse gases. But if you want to reduce your emissions of greenhouse gases, either your growth will suffer or you have to pay additional cost. So India wants to actually do a more carbon neutral growth. However, for that it wants developed countries to supply finances to it, and globally the developing countries, they are demanding some total of $3 trillion every year to attain or to achieve a net zero carbon neutral growth. However, as recently the developed countries, they have agreed that they will only supply $300 billion on an average basis. So this is where the global supply of climate financing, it is not there as expected. Also, to follow a low carbon development path and while ensuring the job creation for all, India will not be able to provide affordable energy services to all. As India is growing more towards the renewable energy sector, here the cost of energy is much higher than what India should have had with the thermal sector. So these are the challenges that India is facing currently. Now, by shifting priorities, let us understand how India can still achieve its growth targets while being carbon neutral. First of all, by bringing adaptation to the forefront of climate change. We have to understand that countries, they cannot just shift away from the path of their general growth patterns. Rather, they should adapt to the changes, and for that it needs financing. Also, India wants to reduce the emissions intensity of its existing thermal power plants, and for that it needs adoption of newer technologies like supercritical, ultra supercritical as well as advanced ultra supercritical technologies, which will reduce the emissions made by the thermal energy sector in India. Also, with focuses on environmental sustainability, for example, by following life, India can actually reduce the resources it needs for its day-to-day consumption, and this will save a lot of resources, and it will also reduce the amount of greenhouse gases and its emissions. Now, moving to the next chapter, which relates to social sector, and it highlights the importance of social sector in our country's economic prospects. Now, in recent times, the government social sector spending, both of central and state government combined, it has witnessed an actual growth rate of 15%, and because of government's increased social sector spending, the inequality in India, it has actually reduced, which is highlighted by Gini coefficient here. For example, if you can see from this chart, India used to spend about 10.4 lakh crore rupees on social sector in financial year 2017-18, and this has increased about 2.5 times in the current financial year of about 25.7 lakh crore. So this highlights in absolute measure, India is spending 2.5 times more after a decade on the social sector and its related services. Now, social sector and services are primarily related to health, rural development, education, etc. So, for example, as we have heard in the recent news that India has witnessed improvement in the learnings of its school, and for that India has improved the basic facilities which are available in school, like construction of toilets, hand wash facilities, availability of library, provision of electricity, provision of medical services or digital services like computer and internet. And also India is focusing more on achieving foundation literacy and numeracy, which is also highlighted in the Pratham report. It is undertaking social and emotional learning of a child, and it is also providing them with necessary life skill, which is not just regarding to their education but also enables them to get jobs after they have done their education. Now, let us consider the healthcare sector. Here, the most important provision in the recent past has been the provision of health insurance under the Jan Arogya Yojana, that is Ayushman Bharat. Now, here support of rupees 5 lakh is available to every family on a yearly basis, as they can undertake treatment for this much amount of money in a tertiary or a secondary hospital. And for improvement of their primary healthcare services, the over 1.7 lakh of Ayushman Arogya Mandirs have been made in operation, which provides for a comprehensive primary care and also delivery of immunization services. Also, for immunization of its children and pregnant women, India is undertaking e-Sanjeevani provision, which is a telemedicine initiative. To undertake monitoring and delivery of vaccination, UWIN portal has been formed, and Abha IDs has been created, which provides an ID for every people located and their related health care problems. So this is how the government has undertaken developments of its healthcare services and also provision of these services to the people who have not had the access of affordable medical services. And because of these services, the out-of-pocket expenditures of people made on medical or their medical and healthcare related have actually reduced from 62.6% to 39.4%. So that is why you can understand how such social sector initiatives have the potential to reduce inequality in India. Because if the poor people must be spending this high amount of money on healthcare services, this might be pushing them further deep into poverty. And the most important credit has been given to Ayushman Bharat Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, which has resulted into saving of about 1.25 lakh crore rupees for Indian public. Also, to undertake rural development, the government is undertaking construction of toilets under Swachh Bharat Mission. Provision of drinking and water supply has been ensured through Mission Amrit Sarovar. National Health Mission Rural is undertaking development of primary healthcare sectors and community healthcare sectors. So does Sansad Adarsh Gram Yojana, which is undertaking development of villages for adequate services. Jal Jeevan Mission ensures supply of drinking water into the rural areas, and Pradhan Mantri Gramin Awas Yojana provides for provision of affordable housing even to the people who are living in Kacha or non-Pakka houses. Non-Pakka houses means houses which are made out of mud and not of concrete and bricks, etc. So this is how delivery of services have also been ensured by construction of roads under the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. Now moving to the next chapter, this deals with the prospects of employment and skill development. Here the article states, or the economic survey states that 26% of India's population is expected to be in age group of 10 to 24 years. So you can expect people belonging to this age will move into India's employment force or workforce in the coming years. So naturally, to employ these many people, you have to make jobs and you have to provide them with skill training. And for that, the government is actually highlighting that the unemployment levels in India has actually reduced to just 3.2%. Now, this graph also highlights that the labor force participation rate, that is the people who are actually working or who are willing to work with respect to its population, this has increased. So does workforce participation rate, whereas the unemployment rate has reduced from 6% to 3.2%. Whereas understanding the job prospects or the employment prospects in urban area is concerned, here also the labor force participation rate has increased, whereas the unemployment rate has reduced manifold. So this highlights in against the articles published in the Hindu that the job prospects in India has improved and the unemployment rate has actually reduced, both in urban as well as rural areas. Now, the government has implemented many measures to boost employment. In the last budget, government came up with the PM internship scheme, where the young age people, they'll be provided internship in bigger companies, which will help them do away with the inertia of seeking professional experiences. Also, the net payroll additions under the EPFO, which has more than doubled in the past 6 years, also highlights that the job prospects and the amount of unemployment is actually reducing, or the other hand, job prospects, they are becoming better. Now, one of the most or the major improvements in job prospects in Indian economy is concerned, here the female labor force participation rate has actually improved. Earlier it was around 24%, now it has improved to 36%. However, it still is below the levels of Western nations like US as compared to, and also with China. However, this 12% improvement is a much significant improvement as far as Indian female labor force participation is concerned. So you can see from this graph, the participation level of women in workforce have improved everywhere in India, and these are related to many developments that have been undertaken by government. For example, government provides access to credit to women entrepreneurs through schemes like Stand Up India, Startup India. Women are provided credit guarantee schemes also, which enables them to seek formal financing. The Adivasi Mahila Sashakti-karan Yojana and PM Employment Guarantee Yojana also extends them with some kind of access to credit is concerned. Whereas support to women-owned entrepreneurship, here formalization initiative have taken place. They have given preferences in procurement by PSUs, and also fully subsidized zero effect, zero defect certification are also provided to them. Women entrepreneurs and their products, they are provided marketing supports. For example, there are many instances like Lijjat Papad that have gained prominence just because these are women-based enterprises. And only after the marketing efforts have been done, then only people realize that their products are actually much better than what is available in the market. And this improves the potentiality that your products will be sold in much higher numbers. Further, skill development through the initiative of Sankalp, Coir Development, PM Kaushal Vikas Yojana provides women with the adequate skill, and that is why we have seen women workers, they are primarily engaged in high skilled workforce, particularly in assembly of mobile phones, construction of automobiles, as many Ola companies like Ola, they are providing jobs to women exclusively. So this highlights that once you provide them with access to credit, once you then provide support to women enterprises, provide them with marketing support and provide them with skill training, it improves the job prospects of women. And this is reflected here also in the skilling efforts that have been undertaken by government, as government is undertaking reskilling and upskilling of its individuals through ITI centers, through PM Kaushal Vikas Yojana, and through Jan Shakti-karan Sansthan. Also, women's participation in workforce, as I've told you, has improved just because they are participating more in the skills levels or skill trainings. Further, with international mobility, that Government of India is looking for opportunity, that if Indian labor is in demand in other countries, the Indian labor are accordingly provided with training, and they are expedited to be sent to other countries. Also, new age and future skills such as skill training for digital services, AI, machine learning, these are provided, and industry-based partnership are formed where academia and industry, they are collaborating in order to develop the necessary skills which will be ultimately used by the industries. Also, digital public infrastructure for skilling has been created, as these initiatives, portals, etc., that can be utilized to provide for skill training to its various sectors. Understood? Now, there are many factors that are driving the job opportunities for Indian employed youth. First of all is the need for digital economy. As India's digital economy, it is expected to surpass $1 trillion by this financial year, that is 2025. And one of the example of digitization and how it has improved the employment prospects in the country, you can witness by gig workers who are employed on platforms like Swiggy, Zomato, Ola, Uber, as people, they are using technology to access more and more or providing more and more services just by the use of technology. Also, jobs in renewable energy sector, as India is witnessing huge demand for renewable energy sector, the installation of these kind of energy sectors, these are providing youth to about 4.5 lakh youth in India. I'm sorry. So this is how not just the global economic prospects are increasing, but also the employability of Indian youth have increased thanks to the skill training initiatives by the government of India. Now moving to the last chapter, it deals with labor in the age of AI. How AI is expected to improve or reduce the employment prospects of youth in any country. For example, development of artificial intelligence, it promises the era where the bulk of economically valuable work will be automated. For example, repetitive tasks or redundant tasks, they can be automated, which will do away with the need of hiring additional workforce for that. So it is anticipated that the AI, it will surpass the human performances in critical decision making sectors like healthcare, agriculture, etc. Hence, what you need is actually to provide a collaborative effort between government private sector, which is essential to minimize the adverse effect on the society. Because if you deploy AI ruthlessly, it will reduce the prominence or the availability of jobs for people. So what you need is actually the collaborative effort between technology and manpower on one hand, so you can use the best of both fields and not ignore ones for others. For that, you have to understand that there are still many challenges in adoption of AI. First is the of practicality. For example, translating breakthrough practicals in practical applications can be quite tough. For example, if you want to hire the services of a professional photographer for your wedding event, so will you rely on a professional photographer who is a person, or you will rely on a digital AI tool to edit your wedding photos? Not right. So you will hire a professional photographer just because a professional photographer is a more reliable than a technology or AI which can use to edit your photos. So the practicality terms, the AI is not so practical. And in terms of reliability, as these autonomous vehicles, they use AI in large numbers. So can you rely autonomous vehicles in Indian roads to be the safest option? No, you'd still want a human driver behind the vehicle, which is more alert and aware than any AI program can ever be. Also, in terms of delivery of AI services, it requires the presence of huge infrastructure like data centers, which in current terms can be quite difficult when you want to construct more data centers. Whereas in terms of resource available with countries like India, India still is dependent on financial models and the technological models of other nations so as to deliver AI based services on it. So in that case, large language models, they are not absent. So this highlights the challenge that India faces in adoption of AI, that first of all, AI is not practical. If practical, it can be reliable, and there are also constraints in access of infrastructure or other resources. Now, first of all, you have to understand that there are coordinated efforts between the government and private sector in order to make this AI labor augmenting and not labor replacing. As AI, it provides both opportunities as well as challenges for labor rich India. At the past technological revolution, we have expected that they can be quite disruptive if they are not managed carefully. So as to prevent the disruption, what we need is an enabling, ensuring and a stewarding institutions that makes the best out of both technology as well as manpower. As careful deployment in optimized over a long horizon is the way forward, rather not intensive development in a short period of time. So what we need is AI not to replace the workforce, rather it should augment or to support and supplement the workforce so as to make workforce a more productive workforce. Now, leveraging this young, dynamic and tech-savvy population, India actually has the potential to create a workforce that can utilize AI to augment their work and productivity. For example, AI can be used to replace redundant tasks, which will make humans available or will put humans at a much significant time so that they can use it for more economically productive activities, and that is why their work and productivity can actually be improved. And the future of AI revolves around augmented intelligence, which means that AI should not replace workforce, rather it should help the humans and machines in their capabilities so that it leads to overall improvement in the efficiency of job performance, it improves the productivity of the workforce, and it ultimately benefits the society as a whole. Understood? Now, as I told you, this brings us to the end of today's session. Please show us your appreciation by hitting the thumbs up button, and also please share this video for more viewers. And if you want to stay updated for more such videos related to economic survey, budget or other important current affairs event, please do not forget to subscribe our channel. And the notes will be available on this channel called ATS Live. So please go on this channel, as I will make sure to make these notes available immediately after the session ends. So this was from my side for today. I'll see you again. Until then, keep watching, keep revising, and more importantly, keep analyzing.